John Adams was born on October 30, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts, a town located just south of Boston with views of Boston Harbor. His father, John Adams Sr., was a farmer and deacon who also worked as a shoemaker and local tax collector. The Adams family traced its roots back to Henry Adams, John's great-grandfather, who immigrated to Massachusetts from Braintree, Essex, England, in 1638. Henry established the first colonial settlement in Braintree, Massachusetts, naming it after his hometown in England. John Adams Sr. achieved moderate affluence, enabling him to purchase a farmstead in Quincy, though the family was not considered especially wealthy. John's mother, Susanna Boylston, came from a prominent family in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, and married John Adams Sr. in 1734. John was their first child, followed by his brothers Peter in 1738 and Elihu in 1741. Adams' childhood reflected the middle-class upbringing typical of colonial Massachusetts in the mid-18th century. He attended a mixed-gender school where the primary educational material was the New England Primer**, a textbook first published in the late 1680s. This text focused on instilling Puritan religious values while teaching basic literacy skills. However, it offered little in the way of intellectual development. Upon completing his elementary education, Adams advanced to Braintree Latin School. Here he embarked on a classical humanist education, studying Latin, rhetoric, logic, philosophy, and arithmetic. The curriculum was also influenced by the scientific advancements of the Enlightenment era. Though Adams excelled academically, his rebellious and questioning nature often caused conflicts during his time at the Latin School, traits that would later make him well-suited for revolutionary leadership. Adams' early years unfolded during a period when America was vastly different from the nation it would become. In the mid-18th century, the eastern coast of North America was dominated by British, French, and Spanish colonies. The Spanish controlled Florida, while the French governed New France, which roughly corresponds to present-day eastern Canada. The British had established colonies between these territories, starting with Virginia and New England in the early 17th century, and expanded to form 13 distinct colonies by Adams' time. These colonies were categorized into 3 regions. New England, where Adams was born, included New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, with Boston as its economic hub. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were the most diverse in terms of ethnicity and religion and were gaining economic prominence due to the growth of cities like New York and Philadelphia. The southern colonies, including Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, were largely rural and focused on cash crops like tobacco and cotton, resulting in a significant reliance on enslaved labor. All 13 colonies were under British control, with colonists paying taxes to the Crown despite lacking political representation in Britain, issues that would eventually lead to widespread unrest. However, in the 1750s, revolution was far from John Adams' mind as he focused on becoming a distinguished scholar. In 1751, John Adams began attending Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the oldest institution of higher learning in North America. It was here that he developed a strong interest in the works of great Greek and Roman authors, particularly historians such as Thucydides, Livy, and Tacitus, as well as the rhetorical and political writings of Cicero and Quintilian. He was also greatly influenced by the political, philosophical, and cultural writings emerging from the European Enlightenment, which addressed the concepts of political liberty and representation in response to the absolutist monarchies of countries like Russia and France during the pre-revolutionary Ancien regime. A particularly impactful work in this regard was The Spirit of the Laws*, published by Charles Louis II at Baron de Montesquieu in 1748. The book was quickly translated into English in 1750, and its arguments on political liberty and the rights of citizens before the law became a significant influence on some of the American founding fathers, including Adams, in the 1750s and 1760s. Adams' interest in the law deepened significantly during this time. After earning his Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard in 1754, he swiftly began studying law, earning a Master of Arts degree from Harvard in 1758. In 1759, at just 24 years old, he was admitted to the bar. Around the same time he was completing his graduate studies and preparing to practice law, Adams began courting his third cousin, Abigail Smith. Their courtship was relatively slow by the standards of the time, and Adams did not propose until several years later. Consequently, they were not married until October 1764. Their relationship was based on mutual respect, and Abigail often served as a moderating influence on John, who, while respected for his honor by his political peers, was sometimes seen as inflexible and even arrogant. The couple settled on Adams' 9.5-acre farm in Quincy, just outside Braintree, which he had inherited after his father's death in 1761. Adams began building a successful legal career, one that was founded on his growing reputation for intellectual rigor and legal expertise in Boston. He and Abigail soon started a family, with their first child, a daughter named Abigail after her mother, born in 1765. They would have 5 more children: John Quincy in 1767, Susanna in 1768, Charles in 1770, Thomas in 1772, and Elizabeth in 1777. Tragically, 2 of the younger daughters did not survive. Susanna passed away in infancy in 1769, and Elizabeth was stillborn. While John Adams was pursuing his studies, establishing his law career, the 13 colonies were caught in the turbulence of global conflict. In 1756, Britain and France entered into the 7 Years' War *, often regarded as the first global war, involving battles across Europe, the Americas, and Asia between the 2 primary belligerents and their allies. The conflict stemmed from long-standing Anglo-French rivalries, fueled further by territorial disputes between British colonies and French holdings in New France, Canada, and Louisiana. Although many British colonists fought in the war, Adams did not participate, as he was still a student at Harvard when hostilities began. Nonetheless, the war significantly affected him and other colonial subjects. Britain emerged victorious in 1763, acquiring Canada from France under the Peace of Paris. This victory came largely through the support and sacrifices of the colonial community. Many in the 13 colonies hoped that their contributions would result in greater political representation within the British government. However, they were soon disillusioned when London responded by imposing heavier taxation on the colonies to recoup the war's costs, sparking widespread resentment and beginning the radicalization of figures like Adams. During this period, Adams' political inclinations started to take shape, and he began voicing his opinions through writing. Using the pseudonym Humphrey Plowjogger, Adams contributed to the Boston Evening Post. Adopting the guise of a plain-speaking New England farmer, he criticized certain political stances taken by influential Bostonians who published in outlets like the Boston Gazette. While Adams shared concerns about British overreach, he advocated for a measured approach, suggesting that colonial administrators should be judged by their actions rather than their affiliation with the Crown. His writings demonstrated a growing commitment to defending colonial rights, yet he had not fully embraced the idea of severing ties with Britain. Instead, Adams sought a balance between challenging unwarranted British interference and maintaining allegiance to the Crown. This cautious yet critical stance would evolve as Adams and the colonies faced escalating tensions with the British government in the coming years. The Stamp Act of 1765 was a pivotal moment in the increasing tensions between Britain and its colonies. This decree required that all printed materials in the 13 colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards, carry a revenue stamp, symbolizing a tax paid to the British government. The rationale behind the act was to recoup expenses from the 7 Years' War, a conflict that Britain argued had been fought to protect its American colonies from French invasion. However, the act was deeply unpopular in the colonies, as it represented taxation without representation. John Adams emerged as a vocal critic of the Stamp Act. Writing under his pseudonym, Humphrey Plowjogger, He published articles opposing the act and authored the Braintree Instructions, a formal statement outlining his objections. Adams argued that the taxation was inequitable, as it did not mirror the taxes levied on subjects in Britain. The widespread colonial outrage forced the British government to repeal the Stamp Act in March 1766. This marked one of the first instances of Adams publicly positioning himself against British policies in Massachusetts. By the late 1760s, Adams had relocated his family to Boston and established himself as a leading lawyer. His opposition to British policies continued, particularly against the Townshend Acts of 1767 and 1768, which imposed new taxes on goods imported to the colonies. Despite his criticisms, Adams also demonstrated a commitment to legal fairness and impartiality. This was most evident following the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, when British soldiers fired on a mob in Boston, killing 5 individuals. Amid the widespread outrage, Adams agreed to defend the accused soldiers in court, arguing that they deserved a fair trial despite the public fury. His skilled legal defense led to the acquittal of Captain Thomas Preston and most of the soldiers involved. Adams' reputation grew further when he was elected to the Massachusetts legislature in the months following the Boston Massacre. However, his disillusionment with British rule deepened with the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. The act aimed to curb the smuggling of Dutch tea into the colonies and force Americans to buy surplus tea from the British East India Company. The act's implementation enraged colonists, culminating in the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773. That night, protesters boarded the Dartmouth, a British ship docked in Boston Harbor, and dumped 342 crates of tea valued at nearly $2 million today into the harbor. Adams celebrated the Boston Tea Party *, calling it one of the grandest events in the history of colonial resistance. This act of defiance, combined with Britain's increasingly punitive measures, convinced Adams that peaceful negotiation with the Crown was no longer viable. By 1773, Adams had become a committed advocate for revolutionary action, marking a turning point in his political career and the broader movement toward American independence. The early to mid-1770s were transformative years for John Adams, as his political ideology hardened in response to British policies that increasingly appeared overbearing and tyrannical. Events such as the Tea Act, the direct payment of judges' salaries by the British government, and the punitive naval blockade of Boston Harbor following the Boston Tea Party radicalized Adams. These actions by Westminster convinced him, and many others, that the Crown's intent was to erode colonial autonomy and impose authoritarian control. Adams became a pivotal figure in the First Continental Congress in 1774, which convened in response to these perceived injustices. He navigated the diverse viewpoints among the 56 delegates, from radicals advocating immediate revolution to moderates seeking reconciliation. Through Adams' ability to mediate and compromise, the Congress adopted the Continental Association, a collective agreement to boycott British trade as a means of pressuring London for concessions. Petitions were also sent to King George III, outlining the colony's grievances and seeking redress. The British government's response to these measures was unequivocal and hostile. In early 1775, Parliament declared the colonies to be in rebellion and instructed the military to disarm colonial militias. The situation escalated on April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, marking the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Adams, now fully convinced of the need for independence, took a leading role in advocating for organized resistance and governmental formation at the Second Continental Congress, which convened in May 1775. During the summer of 1775, Adams was instrumental in the establishment of the Continental Army. Recognizing the need for a professional and unified military force, he strongly supported the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. This strategic decision helped to unify the colonies, particularly by securing the support of the southern colonies through the appointment of a Virginian leader. While Adams signed the Olive Branch Petition, A final appeal for reconciliation sent to King George III in July 1775, he viewed it as futile. The petition's rejection and the Crown's formal declaration of rebellion in August cemented Adams' belief that independence was the only viable path forward. The remainder of 1775 and the early months of 1776 saw Adams and his fellow delegates at the Second Continental Congress laying the groundwork for an independent American government, grappling with the monumental tasks of raising revenue, organizing military efforts, and establishing the administrative framework of a nascent nation. This pivotal period highlighted Adams' indispensable role as a unifying and pragmatic leader in the revolutionary movement, setting the stage for the formal Declaration of Independence in July 1776. By the early summer of 1776, John Adams stood at the forefront of the revolutionary movement as the momentum for independence reached its zenith. The ongoing intensification of the war and the unwavering hostility from the British Crown and Parliament left little room for reconciliation. The decision to formally declare independence became inevitable. Adams was selected as one of 5 members of a committee tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence, alongside Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Although Jefferson was the primary author, Adams played a significant role in shaping the document, providing critical suggestions and collaborating closely with Jefferson and Franklin to refine its content. This collaboration marked the beginning of a complex and enduring relationship between Adams and Jefferson, defined by both camaraderie and rivalry. On July 4, 1776, after fervent debates, Adams passionately defended the Declaration before the Continental Congress, leading to its ratification. The United States of America was officially born, but its independence would only become a reality through continued military struggle. In the war's early years, Adams emerged as an indispensable figure in the Second Continental Congress. Between 1775 and 1778, the conflict focused heavily on New England and the Middle Colonies. The Patriots achieved a significant victory by capturing Boston in 1776, but the British countered by seizing New York City later that year and Philadelphia in 1777. The tide of war shifted dramatically in October 1777 with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This pivotal battle not only demoralized British forces but also convinced France to formally ally with the Patriots, providing critical military and economic support. Adams' contributions during this period were monumental. As a senior member of Congress, he participated in 90 committees and chaired more than 24. Appointed in June 1776, Adams became responsible for ensuring the Continental Army was properly equipped with weapons, ammunition, and other supplies. His meticulous attention to logistics and relentless work ethic, often putting in 18-hour days, proved crucial in sustaining the war effort. Adams spearheaded efforts to establish strong ties with European powers like France, the Dutch Republic, and Prussia. He played a key role in drafting the Model Treaty, a blueprint for commercial agreements between the United States and foreign nations. This work laid the groundwork for alliances that would provide much-needed resources and military assistance. Adams' advocacy for forging alliances with European powers led to his appointment as a commissioner to France in November 1777, shortly after the victory at Saratoga. France had been a vital source of financial and material support for the Patriots, but the Congress now sought a formal military alliance. Adams' diplomatic mission aimed to solidify France's commitment, a move that would prove instrumental in securing American independence. Through his tireless efforts in Congress and his strategic vision on the international stage, Adams became a cornerstone of the revolutionary cause. His leadership not only helped sustain the Patriots through the early challenges of the war but also positioned the United States to gain critical support from European allies, ultimately ensuring the success of the revolution. Adams departed for France in the spring of 1778 with his eldest son, John Quincy Adams, while his wife, Abigail, remained in Braintree, managing the family in his absence. His arrival coincided with the French government already having agreed to a formal alliance with the United States following the American victory at Saratoga. However, Adams faced challenges in his diplomatic role, as the French court, particularly King Louis XVI's ministers, preferred the affable and tactful approach of Benjamin Franklin over Adams' more direct and assertive style. By late 1778, Franklin was elevated to minister plenipotentiary to France, effectively sidelining Adams. Feeling unneeded, Adams chose to return to Massachusetts in March 1779. Adams' respite in America was brief. In late 1779, the Second Continental Congress appointed him to oversee potential peace negotiations with Britain. He returned to Europe and attempted to foster diplomatic progress in Paris, but the British showed little interest in talks as the war stalemated. Frustrated by the lack of progress and persistent tensions with the French, Adams moved to Amsterdam in mid-1780 to seek financial and diplomatic support from the Dutch Republic. The Dutch government initially rebuffed his overtures, refusing to recognize him as the official U.S. ambassador. Adams grew disheartened by what he perceived as European powers prioritizing their own strategic interests over genuine support for the American cause. His health deteriorated, culminating in an illness in August 1781, likely exacerbated by exhaustion and stress. Adams' spirits revived later in 1781 with the stunning news from North America. General Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown in October 1781, following a decisive Franco-American siege, marked a turning point in the war. The British defeat shifted public sentiment in Europe, particularly in the Dutch Republic, where Adams successfully secured recognition of the United States as an independent nation in April 1782. This breakthrough enabled him to negotiate a substantial loan to support the Continental Congress. Adams returned to Paris to participate in formal peace negotiations with a British delegation led by David Hartley. Although the British had little choice but to recognize American independence, numerous contentious issues required resolution. These included establishing the boundary between the United States and British Canada, securing fishing rights off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and addressing reparations for Loyalists choosing to leave the new nation. Adams, along with Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, worked diligently to finalize the terms of peace. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, officially ending the Revolutionary War. The agreement not only secured American independence but also established critical precedents for the young nation's future, such as territorial boundaries and international trade rights. The Treaty of Paris was a monumental achievement for Adams and his fellow negotiators, representing the culmination of years of military and diplomatic effort. Adams' persistence and strategic acumen in Europe ensured that the United States emerged from the war not only as an independent nation but also as a respected player on the global stage. The conclusion of the war and the signing of the treaty did not result in John Adams returning home. Instead, he was entrusted with what would prove to be one of his most challenging diplomatic roles when he became the first ambassador of the United States to Britain. Arriving in London in 1785, Adams faced the formidable task of establishing friendly relations with a nation that had been the United States' adversary in a recent war, a nation that was not only the largest trading power globally but also shared the longest border with the United States. Shortly after his arrival, Adams met King George III, and their interactions were marked by mutual respect. However, his tenure in London was fraught with difficulties stemming from both the British and American government's failure to fully honor the provisions of the Treaty of Paris. In Philadelphia, for instance, there was little urgency to compensate British merchants and American loyalists, while the British, in turn, delayed relinquishing control of forts along the Ohio River as agreed. Despite these frustrations, Adams found solace in having his family together. His children were now old enough for Abigail to join him in London, marking the first extended period they had spent together in several years. By 1788, it was evident that Adams had achieved as much as he could in England, and his presence there was no longer necessary. Meanwhile, in the United States, the political environment was undergoing a significant transformation as the nation's leaders worked to draft a new constitution and prepare for the first presidential election. Adams and Abigail returned home, where they observed a vigorous debate between advocates of a more inclusive democracy and conservatives who preferred limiting power to landowners and the wealthy. The culmination of these efforts was the creation of the U.S. Constitution, largely shaped by James Madison, a political thinker from Virginia and a member of the Second Continental Congress, with contributions from figures like Alexander Hamilton. Madison drew heavily from the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, a document to which Adams had made substantial contributions. The new Constitution, finalized in 1789, established a bicameral Congress, consisting of an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. This structure balanced the push for popular democracy with the interests of the elite, as the House represented the people while the Senate catered to the concerns of the wealthy and landed classes. The Constitution also introduced a federal system where every state, regardless of size or population, would send 2 senators, ensuring equal representation in legislation. The judiciary was headed by a Supreme Court, while the executive branch was led by a president elected through the Electoral College, a system granting each state a certain number of votes. This carefully designed compromise sought to address the concerns of both conservatives and liberals, as well as proponents of federal power and individual state independence, with checks and balances ensuring no single branch of government could dominate. Adams closely followed the Constitution's development, harboring ambitions to become the first president of the United States. However, it soon became apparent that George Washington was the favored candidate across the 13 states in the election held in late 1788 and early 1789. Recognizing Washington's unassailable position, Adams and other contenders focused their efforts on the vice presidency, leaving Washington uncontested for the highest office. During America's early years, the vice president was elected through the Electoral College, rather than being selected as a running mate by the president, as is customary today. John Adams secured this position and in the spring of 1789, traveled to New York City, which briefly served as the nation's temporary capital before the government relocated to Philadelphia. Meanwhile, construction began on a permanent capital along the Potomac River, which would eventually be named Washington, D.C. in honor of the first president. At the time, the role of vice president held little significance, with its primary constitutional duty being to preside over the Senate. Adams quickly faced resistance from senators, particularly regarding how the president should be addressed. His conservative tendencies and perceived admiration for monarchy became apparent when he suggested the title, Highness, traditionally used for royalty. This proposal was rejected, and the simpler Mr. President was adopted. These early disagreements earned Adams the animosity of many senators. Despite casting more deciding votes in the Senate than almost any other vice president, Adams grew increasingly dissatisfied with his role, famously calling it the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Adams' frustrations were compounded by George Washington's decision to largely exclude him from key policy discussions, with the exception of issues related to France. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789 and led to the Revolutionary Wars, Washington sought Adams' opinion due to his prior diplomatic experience in France. Initially hopeful about the revolution, Adams soon grew disillusioned, seeing it devolve into chaos and violence, particularly during the Reign of Terror in the early 1790s. Despite offering valuable insights on these matters, Adams was generally sidelined within the administration, further deepening his sense of insignificance. Adams' time as vice president coincided with the rise of the first-party system in American politics. This era was defined by the rivalry between the Federalist Party led by Alexander Hamilton and the Democratic-Republican Party founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Federalists advocated for a strong central government, industrial development and closer ties with Britain. Their support base was strongest in New England and urbanized states such as New York and Pennsylvania. In contrast, the Democratic Republicans championed agrarianism, Republican ideals and westward expansion, drawing significant support from the southern plantation states. They also expressed more open support for slavery compared to the Federalists. Adams aligned himself with the Federalist Party, endorsing Hamilton's economic policies and advocating for stronger relations with Britain over revolutionary France. When Washington announced he would not seek a third term, fearing that an extended presidency might resemble monarchy or military dictatorship, it opened the door to the first contested presidential election in American history. Jefferson became the leading candidate for the Democratic Republicans, while Adams, despite his uneasy relationship with Hamilton, emerged as the Federalist frontrunner. The campaign was conducted primarily through partisan newspapers, and the rhetoric was fierce, reflecting the widening divisions among the Founding Fathers. Ultimately, Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson, securing 71 Electoral College votes to Jefferson's 68, while another Federalist candidate, Thomas Pinckney, finished third with 59 votes. Although the Democratic Republicans dominated the southern states, Adams managed to win critical support in key middle states like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, allowing him to claim victory. As the second highest vote-getter, Jefferson became vice president. However, the once strong friendship between Adams and Jefferson had deteriorated over the years, evolving into a tense rivalry fueled by their differing political visions and the growing partisanship of the time. John Adams was inaugurated as president on March 4, 1797. His presidency was dominated by the question of whether the United States should go to war with France, which was embroiled in conflicts with major European powers and undergoing a radical phase of its own revolution. France's hostility toward organized religion and its aggressive foreign policies prompted some Americans to support joining Britain's anti-French coalition. However, many in the U.S. still regarded France as a key ally from the Revolutionary War and harbored lingering resentment against Britain. Adams favored peace and sent a diplomatic delegation to France, but the mission failed disastrously when French officials referred to as X, Y, and Z in reports demanded bribes as a precondition for negotiations. When this scandal, later known as the XYZ affair, became public, it incited widespread outrage against France. Although Adams could have used the incident to justify declaring war, he resisted and maintained American neutrality. While tensions led to a brief quasi-war with France in 1798 to 1799, involving limited naval skirmishes, Adams avoided full-scale conflict, reinforcing a precedent of American reluctance to become entangled in European wars, a principle that persisted until World War II. The XYZ affair also led to heightened fears of foreign subversion within the U.S. In response, Congress enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These 4 laws targeted French immigrants and those suspected of sympathizing with France. Critics accused Adams of using these acts to suppress political opposition, particularly pro-democratic Republican newspapers. Although Adams had not initiated the legislation and signed it reluctantly, the acts fueled accusations of censorship and executive overreach, controversies that continue to shadow his legacy. Adams' presidency was also marked by his being the first president to reside in Washington, D.C., the newly constructed federal capital. The city, situated on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia, symbolized efforts to unify the northern and southern states. In November 1800, Adams moved into the president's mansion, later named the White House, and Congress convened for the first time in the Capitol building. Despite these milestones, his term faced challenges including Fry's Rebellion, a tax revolt in Pennsylvania. Adams chose leniency, pardoning the leaders who had been sentenced to death, showcasing his commitment to reconciliation. Tensions with Vice President Thomas Jefferson continued to escalate during Adams' presidency. Their ideological differences on major issues such as relations with France, the role of federal government, and slavery deepened the rift. Jefferson advocated for an alliance with France and supported slavery, owning hundreds of enslaved individuals, while Adams opposed slavery and was instrumental in its gradual abolition in Massachusetts. This division culminated in the fiercely contested election of 1800. Jefferson, running with Aaron Burr as his vice presidential candidate, narrowly defeated Adams, whose campaign suffered from internal Federalist divisions and public dissatisfaction with taxation and foreign policy. After leaving office, Adams retired to his family farm in Quincy, Massachusetts. He avoided active participation in politics, adhering to the precedent set by George Washington. However, his relationship with Jefferson remained strained until 1812, when mutual friend Benjamin Rush facilitated their reconciliation. The two former presidents exchanged letters for over a decade discussing philosophy, retirement, and reflections on their shared history, though they largely avoided revisiting their political disagreements. Adams lived to see his eldest son, John Quincy Adams, elected as the sixth President of the United States in 1825, a source of great pride. He passed away on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, just hours after Jefferson's death. Adams was laid to rest alongside his wife Abigail at the United First Parish Church in Quincy, leaving behind a complex but enduring legacy. John Adams, the second President of the United States, was a visionary leader who helped lay the foundation of American democracy. He played a crucial role in drafting the Declaration of Independence and was a fierce advocate for liberty and justice. Adams' dedication to the rule of law and his diplomatic efforts, particularly in securing peace with France, showcased his commitment to the nation's stability. His presidency emphasized the importance of a balanced government and civil liberties, leaving a lasting legacy. Even after his tenure, Adams remained a symbol of integrity and patriotism in American history. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next. Until then, keep striving for success, and see you in the next video.